75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. We have spent weeks documenting Americans who survived the Holocaust as they prepared to go back. And over the weekend, it was an honor and privilege to travel back with them.
They told us about the Holocaust. They told us about Auschwitz. But what they didn't tell us is what haunts the silence between the lines of our history books. Beyond the numbers and names lie stories so harrowing, many history classes chose silence over detail. This isn't just a story about suffering, it's a descent into the darkest corners of humanity and the unspeakable truths buried beneath the ashes of Auschwitz. All right, let's get something straight. What you learned about Auschwitz in school is like watching the trailer of a movie and thinking you saw the whole movie. We all saw the black and white photos, the barbed wire fences, and heard about the gas chambers. But there's another side of Auschwitz they didn't talk about, not because it didn't matter, but because it was the kind of truth that doesn't just haunt you, it rewrites everything you thought you knew. Behind those infamous gates wasn't just a camp, it was a system meticulously built to dehumanize and erase lives on an unimaginable scale. Auschwitz wasn't just about mass execution, it was a carefully choreographed production of suffering. Every step, every decision was planned to inflict maximum pain, psychological torture, and dehumanization on a scale the world had never seen. But that's still not the wildest part. Did you know people volunteered to go there as part of the resistance? And get this, there was an actual Nazi-run brothel on site. It was regarded as a forced reward system to make prisoners work harder. Auschwitz wasn't just a killing center, it was also a twisted social experiment. A place where so-called doctors played Frankenstein on living people, where human lives were reduced to data points. And some of these experiments they conducted, you wouldn't even find that level of horror in a slasher film. Today, in this video, we are diving into the details that textbooks tiptoe around. So buckle up, because the next few minutes are going to challenge what you thought you knew. Number 6. The Man Who Snuck into Hell. Let me tell you a story that sounds like something straight out of a high-budget Netflix drama, except it's 100% real, and somehow even crazier. You've probably never heard of Witold Pilecki, and it's not your fault, because this man's story was suppressed.
The story of Witold Pilecki is one of the great 20th century stories of bravery and sacrifice.
During the Soviet-backed communist era, but once you hear what he did, you are definitely not going to forget his name. In 1940, Nazi Germany was combing through Europe, imprisoning anyone they deemed a threat in concentration camps. However, in Poland, things were especially brutal. But in the middle of this chaos was a man called Witold Pilecki, a man who made a decision so wild and unthinkable that even other resistance fighters were beyond shock. Pilecki volunteered to be arrested and sent to Auschwitz. He wasn't captured, nor was he forced. He willingly chose to go inside the deadliest Nazi concentration camp, the same one we all now recognize as the symbol of unspeakable horror. Now, you are probably thinking, this man probably had a death wish. But no, he had a mission. Witold Pilecki wanted to infiltrate Auschwitz, build a resistance network from the inside, and smuggle out reports to tell the world what the Nazis were really doing there. Pilecki got himself arrested during a Nazi roundup in Warsaw by blending himself with a group of civilians being herded like cattle. And the next thing you know, he was on a train bounded for Auschwitz. From his very first day there, he saw the full, raw horror of the camp. Public executions, random beatings, people starving to death right in front of him, diseases running rampant, especially typhus, basically all kinds of things that would mentally break anyone within days. But somehow, he managed to keep his cover, and not only that, he got to work. While barely surviving himself, Pilecki started organizing other prisoners in a strategic and calculated way. He created a whole underground organization inside the camp called Związek Organizacji Wojskowej. Through this organization, he was able to pass messages to the Polish underground resistance, sending out reports that detailed exactly what was going on behind those gates. We're talking names of officers, transport schedules, and even first-hand accounts of the gas chambers. Pilecki stayed in Auschwitz for approximately 2 years and 7 months. This was almost 3 years of extreme survival, because most people would have either passed or broken beyond recognition within months. But he managed to survive and keep the resistance going. He smuggled documents, built alliances, and it is even believed he arranged secret meetings between prisoners to share information, all while surviving beatings, illness, starvation, and near constant threat of execution. Finally, in 1943, Pilecki said enough. The resistance had reached its limit inside the camp, and the outside world wasn't doing enough, so he did what no one else had done. He escaped Auschwitz. But how could he have done it? And most importantly, did he do it alone? On April 26, 1943, in the middle of the night, he and 2 other prisoners broke out, sprinted through Nazi territory, and somehow made it to safety. After his escape, he went straight back to fighting. He joined the Warsaw Uprising, one of the most intense and bloody resistance movements in Poland. But here's where things get even darker. After the war, Poland fell under Soviet control. And because Pilecki was loyal to the Polish resistance, not the communist regime, he was labeled an enemy of the state. So what did the new government do? They arrested him, tortured him, and accused him of being a spy. Eventually, in 1948, they executed him. The same man who risked everything to expose the Holocaust was executed by his own government for wanting a free Poland. For decades that followed, no one spoke about him. His name was blacklisted, and his story was suppressed. Witold Pilecki wasn't just a hero. He was the kind of hero we didn't even know existed. The kind who walked into the heart of evil not to survive, but to fight. And even after everything he endured at Auschwitz, he kept going with no medals, no glory, just purpose. He survived Auschwitz, escaped, and kept fighting, only to be betrayed by the country he fought to save. But if you think his story was wild, just wait for what's next. Number 5. The Crematorium Revolt. The day Auschwitz blew up from the inside. Let's talk about one of the most shocking, dangerous, and badass acts of resistance that happened inside Auschwitz. You've probably never heard about it, because honestly, when we talk about concentration camps, the narrative is usually all about suffering and death. And while that's absolutely true and devastating, it's not the whole picture. On October 7, 1944, approximately 17 months after Witold Pilecki and some prisoners escaped Auschwitz, another group of prisoners decided they weren't going to die silently. They decided they weren't going to let the Nazis control every part of their story. So they smuggled gunpowder, built homemade explosives, and set one of the crematoriums ablaze. This group of prisoners were known as the Sonderkommando, and if you've never heard of the Sonderkommando, prepare to have your stomach dropped. The Sonderkommandos were mostly Jewish prisoners who were forced to work directly in the crematoriums. This meant they had to escort people to the gas chambers, remove the bodies, clean up afterward, burn the corpses, and dispose of the ashes. It was a real soul-shattering work, and the Nazis picked the strongest and healthiest prisoners for the job. They lied to them by saying it would protect their families, or maybe even extend their lives, but it didn't. Sadly, every few months, the Nazis executed them and replaced them with new prisoners. This was so they couldn't share what they had seen. However, the Sonderkommando weren't just silently waiting for death. They were watching, planning, waiting for a chance. And that chance came in the form of gunpowder that was smuggled into the camp by some of the most unlikely heroes you could ever imagine. Rosa Robota, sisters Esther and Hanka Wachblum, Alla Gertner, and Regina Saphirstein risked everything by sneaking tiny amounts of gunpowder out of the Union munitions plant, hidden in the hems of their clothing, under their fingernails, even tucked inside their shoes. They passed it slowly, bit by bit, to the Sonderkommando in secret, knowing full well that if they were caught, they wouldn't just be executed, but they'd be tortured first, yet they kept doing it. The Sonderkommando collected that gunpowder and turned it into makeshift explosives, despite being under constant surveillance, while pretending to carry out their horrific daily routines. The fact that they even pulled this off without getting caught immediately speaks to a level of coordination and courage they had. Then came October 7th, 1944. That morning, word started circulating that a group of Sonderkommando was about to be executed. Their number was up, and they knew it, so they made the decision that October 7th was the day. They said to themselves that if they were getting executed, the Nazis were going with them. At Crematorium 4, things popped off first. The prisoners attacked the guards, grabbed weapons, and used the smuggled explosives to set the ovens ablaze. They destroyed part of the machinery used to burn bodies, and due to this, that crematorium never operated again. That wasn't just symbolic, it was actual sabotage. Meanwhile, fights broke out in other sections of the camp. It was chaos. Pure, desperate chaos, however. Some prisoners managed to break through the fences, and they ran like their lives depended on it, because, quite frankly, it did. Approximately 80 prisoners attempted to escape during the revolt. However, most of them were recaptured or executed. Only a small number are believed to have successfully escaped. Of course, the Nazis responded with harsh retaliation. Within hours, the rebellion was crushed, and about 200 Sonderkommando were executed without trial. If that already seemed inhumane, the Nazis went even further. They had another group of Sonderkommando carry out the task of disposing of the rebels' bodies. It was a grim reflection of just how deeply broken the system was. Even in death, these men weren't granted dignity. As for the women who smuggled the gunpowder, they were eventually caught. They were interrogated, tortured, and brutalized, but they never gave up the names of anyone else involved. Even when they knew they were going to die, they protected the others. Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Regina Saphirstein, and Esther Weichblum were executed publicly by hanging in January 1945. Their last act was defiance. Fortunately or unfortunately, Hanke Weichblum, Esther's sister, survived the war. In a place designed to erase people, erase their names, their bodies, their histories, these prisoners made a dent. They fought back with everything they had, even when they had next to nothing, and even though the revolt didn't bring down Auschwitz, it proved that resistance wasn't just possible, but it was real. The Sonderkommando Revolt is a reminder that even when the world seems broken beyond repair, there are still those who will risk everything to fight back, and that deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, but as a headline. They turned despair into resistance and chose fire over silence, but they weren't the only ones. Just months later, another forgotten group rose up facing death with nothing but defiance. Number 4. The Roma Uprising, the night they fought back in Auschwitz. Did anyone ever mention that one night there was a full-blown rebellion inside the camp? And it wasn't by soldiers or secret agents, but by Roma prisoners. Let's rewind for a moment. We already established that Auschwitz was a nightmare, but tucked inside the sprawling complex was a lesser-known section called the Zigeunerlager, or the Gypsy Family Camp. That name might sound almost harmless, but don't let it fool you. This wasn't some quiet corner of the camp. This was where thousands of Roma men, women, and entire families were locked away, starved, experimented on, and treated like they weren't even human. By 1944, around 6,000 Roma were packed into that section with no privacy, food, or hope of ever making it out alive. But they had each other. They had community, family, history, and when the Nazis came knocking with orders to clear out the camp and make space for new arrivals, they decided they weren't going to go quietly. On May 15, 1944, word started spreading that everyone in the Roma camp was about to be relocated. However, the prisoners already knew what that meant. They had seen the transports and smelled the smoke. Relocation was code for being marched straight into the gas chambers, and on this night, they were told that all of them, including the children, would be dead by morning. When the guards arrived the next day on May 16th, they expected the usual terror, the pleading, the silence. But instead, they were met with barricades and improvised weapons. Around 6,000 Roma prisoners, many of them just fathers, sons, teenagers, armed themselves with whatever they could find. Hammers, shovels, iron rods ripped from their own bunks. They didn't have guns, they didn't have military training. What they had was desperation, fury, courage, and they refused to allow the Nazis walk them to their deaths. May 16, 1944, the day the Nazis planned to commit a mass execution of Roma's fell swoop and turned into a standoff. The crazy part was that it worked. The Nazis actually backed off and didn't go through with the mass execution that day. They weren't ready for a fight, especially from the very people they had considered weak, broken, beneath them. And for that one night, those prisoners flipped the power dynamic. For just one moment in the timeline of terror, the oppressors were shaken, delayed, and denied. The resistance on May 16th did not result in immediate mass executions. Instead, it led to the postponement of the liquidation. Subsequently, around 3,000 able-bodied Roma were transferred to other concentration camps, and on the night of August 2, 1944, approximately 4,000 remaining Roma prisoners, primarily the elderly, women, and children, were executed in the gas chambers. As sad as that is, what matters was that night. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about dignity, resistance, screaming to the world, even if the world wasn't listening. We are not invisible. We are not helpless. And if that isn't bravery, I don't know what is. The Roma Uprising in Auschwitz is barely mentioned in textbooks. You could read 3 different history syllabi and never even hear a whisper about it. That is why May 16th is now recognized as Romani Resistance Day across Europe. Not just to remember the uprising, but to honor the spirit behind it, because that wasn't just survival, that was legacy. For one night, the Roma stood their ground, but as the Nazis prepared to abandon Auschwitz, a new horror emerged, not in the camps, but on the roads. Number 3, the final cruelty of Auschwitz. It's the middle of winter in Poland, and it's January 1945. The Soviet forces are closing in fast on the Nazis, and they are panicking because their death factory is about to be exposed. So instead of facing justice, they did what they do best. They doubled down on the cruelty, and when you think it can't get worse, it actually does. They started what historians called the death marches, and if you thought the gas chambers were the end, buckle up because the horror didn't stop there. It only changed form. Here's what happened. As Soviet troops advanced from the east, the Nazis had one goal, and that was to erase the evidence. Thousands of starving prisoners who were still alive packed into Auschwitz, living proof of the horrors committed. The Nazis couldn't let them be liberated. So, in the middle of winter, they decided to evacuate them on foot, with no food, no rest, and no mercy. They forced over 56,000 prisoners to march westward to other camps, still under Nazi control. This wasn't some organized relocation, it was a death sentence. We're talking miles and miles of snow-covered roads, wearing striped uniforms with terrible shoes, and some had no shoes at all. The temperature was so cold that their skin could crack, and if any of them fell behind, stumbled, limped, or cried out, it was a bullet to the back with no second chances. The SS guards didn't hesitate. If any of the prisoners couldn't walk, they were executed right there and nobody could stop. Many of these prisoners were barely alive even before the march began. They were so emaciated, they looked like skeletons with skin, and they were forced to walk for weeks toward other camps like Bergen-Belsen or Dachau. The Nazis didn't provide food, clothing, water, or shelter. It was like they wanted to squeeze out every last ounce of suffering before these people passed. The worst part was, it worked because over 15,000 people passed during these forced marches. At least that's the official estimate. But some historians say the number is probably way higher because there were no records, no names, no burial sites, just blood in the snow and bodies dumped in ditches along the way. According to speculation, in some villages, locals would wake up to find entire roads lined with corpses, and the ones who survived barely even remember how. Many of them described walking in a trance, like ghosts. They marched in a daze, numb to pain or thought, because stopping meant death. However, these are believed to be just speculations.
They began to understand that the Nazis had committed atrocities against civilians.
What most people don't realize is these death marches weren't just a side note in the Holocaust. They were the final chapter, the last cruel twist of the knife, because after everything those prisoners endured in the camps, this was their send-off. No dignity, no humanity, just a cold, endless road, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't collapse before the next sunrise. The death marches were more than just an evacuation, the last act of a regime defined by dehumanization, and even in its final days, that system still clung to control, still inflicted suffering, and still refused to show mercy. They survived gas chambers, starvation, and death marches, but what waited behind Auschwitz's walls was a different kind of horror, a place so twisted, even history struggles to speak its name. Number 2. Auschwitz Brothel, a darker corner of depravity. Buried under the layers of death, torture, and human suffering, there was an even more twisted chapter, one that barely gets talked about, one that feels like the kind of detail that would be cut from a movie script for being too much. We're talking about the Auschwitz Brothel, a forced intimacy house inside one of the most infamous death camps in history. This wasn't a random underground operation. It wasn't prisoners sneaking off into shadows. This was an official program, a Nazi project, greenlit, organized, and supervised, and the mastermind behind it was none other than Heinrich Himmler himself. Himmler, the head of the SS, who apparently decided that in order to get more productivity out of male prisoners, he needed to create incentives. Because what motivates a man who's starving and enslaved in a death camp? According to Himmler's logic, women. So in 1942, this disgusting plan was officially launched. The idea was simple and sinister. Set up brothels inside concentration camps, fill them with female prisoners, and use intimacy as a twisted reward for hard labor. You work harder, you get access. That was the deal, and this was pitched like some kind of corporate motivation scheme, only the office was a torture camp, and the bonus was a horrifying form of state-sanctioned forced intimacy. The women in these brothels weren't volunteers. Some were selected from Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, and others were manipulated into agreeing with vague promises of better treatment or more food, which were all lies. Some women were tricked into it, others were dragged in, and by the time they realized what was really happening, they were already inside a locked barrack, forced to entertain multiple men. Keep in mind, these weren't clean, quiet rooms with beds and privacy. They were cramped, filthy spaces inside Auschwitz. Every detail of it was degrading, mechanical, dehumanizing, and every part of it was structured, timed, and recorded by Nazi officers. They kept lists, schedules, even medical checks to monitor the women and keep the men from getting infected not out of care, but control. The total number of women forced into these brothels has been estimated to be between 300 to 400 at one time. Of course, this twisted operation eventually collapsed. As the war dragged on and the Allies got closer, the brothel system was quietly shut down, and the women were either sent back to labor camps or executed. Their stories were rarely recorded, their trauma never given space. And when survivors eventually began speaking out decades later, most people didn't even believe them at first because the idea of a Nazi brothel in Auschwitz sounded too grotesque to be true, but it was. So let's call it what it was: a state-organized intimacy abuse. Not a reward system like they claimed, not comfort houses. This was forced intimacy on a schedule. It was abuse in uniform, and for the men and women involved, there was no safety, no dignity, no justice. The brothel was shut down, the war nearing its end, but the true horror wasn't over. When the Soviets arrived, what they found inside Auschwitz would haunt the world forever. Number 1. The aftermath of Auschwitz. What the Soviets actually found. Everyone talks about what happened inside the camp during the war, but barely anyone dives into the chaos, horror, and pure disbelief of what was left after it ended. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops finally rolled into the most notorious Nazi death camp, and what they found was worse than anything they were prepared for. No one would have written this. Not even Hollywood would go this far, because what the Red Army walked into was the scene of a genocide that didn't even try to hide how brutal it was. Roughly 7,000 survivors were still inside Auschwitz when the Soviets arrived, and the term survivor is a word that barely covers it. These were walking skeletons, people who had been starved to the brink of death. Their clothes were rags, their eyes were hollow, their bodies were covered in sores, frostbite, lice, and wounds that hadn't healed in months, years even. They couldn't speak, they could barely move, and many of them were lying in piles, too weak to stand, too traumatized to even react when help finally came. According to Soviet reports, the stench was inescapable. Rotting bodies, burned flesh, filth. It was so bad that one couldn't breathe without gagging. The soldiers didn't just walk into a liberated camp, they walked into a graveyard where the dead hadn't been buried, and the living hadn't been saved yet. They weren't even fully alive, just lingering. Let's talk numbers for a minute, because the scale of what the Nazis left behind is almost too much for the brain to process. Starting off strong, the Soviets discovered 7.7 tons of human hair. This was hair that had been shaved from the heads of women, men, and even children. It was bagged, labeled, and stacked like cargo, and it is believed that the Nazis did this because they planned to sell it, turn it into stuffing for mattresses and industrial filters. That's how dehumanized these people were. Alongside the hair, the Soviets found over 1 million items of clothing, and this is not an exaggeration. There were over 370,000 men's suits and over 837,000 articles of women's clothing laid out like some twisted lost and found. But everyone who lost these things had either passed or was on their way to dying. These items weren't stored neatly, like some perverse inventory system. They were tossed, crammed into rooms and sheds. It looked like a flea market run by the devil. It was described as walking through the remnants of lives that were stolen, and that's exactly what it was. Stolen lives, stolen dreams, and stolen futures. Let's not forget the documents, because the Nazis, they loved paperwork. They documented everything. Every name, every transport, every roll call, every execution. They did attempt to destroy evidence of their crimes by demolishing crematoria and burning documents, but plenty survived. Just enough to piece together what really went on. Enough to back up every survivor's story with chilling precision. Now here's the part nobody talks about. The Soviets weren't even prepared to help the survivors. You could say they didn't expect the sight they would behold. While the Soviet military was primarily focused on combat operations, they did provide immediate assistance to survivors.
Their first encounters with Holocaust survivors at this unique moment in time.
2 Soviet field hospitals were established to care for liberated prisoners, offering medical treatment and food. However, many of the survivors died after liberation from either illness, starvation, or trauma. It was like being pulled from a burning building only to collapse just outside the door. Some Soviet soldiers were so emotionally shaken by what they saw that they couldn't continue fighting. These were men who'd been through brutal battles across Eastern Europe, and even they admitted that Auschwitz was the worst thing they had ever witnessed. There was no happy ending to this cruelty. Auschwitz didn't get cleaned up overnight. It took years for the world to even start to understand what had happened there, and even longer for people to believe it. That's how unbelievable it was. So why does this matter? Auschwitz didn't just kill people. It tried to erase them, but the possessions left behind all screamed the same thing: that humans were here, humans who had lives, families, and despite the Nazis' attempts to reduce them to ash, they didn't succeed. That's the aftermath, not just survival, but the painful reminder of what was stolen and what must never be allowed to happen again. Do you believe humanity has truly learned from the horrors of Auschwitz? Or are we just better at hiding modern-day cruelty? What responsibility do we as individuals have in keeping these stories alive? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.